Okay, so yeah, I will start right in. My first question is, what is an adequate security concept of the 21st century?
So when I think about security, I think about the places where I've lived and the challenges the people have had. In Burundi, in the middle of the civil war, security was about, can the families keep themselves safe from war, from being killed? Can they keep their families intact? Did their children have the opportunity that you take for granted to go to school? Was there a school? Was there going to be a job for their parents in a poor, undeveloped country? Venezuela, you watch the news. Venezuela's getting pretty tough right now, and it has been tough since the early 2000s. I don't remember the latest number of how many people have been killed demonstrating against the government of Venezuela. But there it's about security. Personal security, are you safe to walk down the streets? Economic security, can you find a job? Can you support your family? Can you have a hope for a future? So security, I'd say, gets very basic. Do you have access to the things you need to support life? Food, water, shelter. Then you get into the things of what is your economic potential? What's your educational potential? But if you can't meet the basics, it's pretty tough to go beyond and to look higher.
Thank you for that. And what would you say, in what way do multilateral institutions contribute to international security and such safety as you just mentioned?
International institutions are pretty critical to the world's security structure. You're hearing a lot about NATO these days and about what NATO means for collective security in Europe. I think it was just in the news tickers this morning, NATO may start looking at a contribution or joining the coalition fighting ISIS, trying to defeat that entity. The United Nations has been pretty critical, but let's step back for a second and think about what led to the United Nations. World War I, pretty horrific war here in Europe, and one of the results of that, you've probably studied this, the League of Nations, a very liberal, high-minded thought that the countries could come together and work out their problems. Well, the League of Nations was another failure. Didn't recognize realist politics, power politics in the world, or how countries really function. League of Nations failed. World War II happened. Having learned the lessons of the League of Nations, we come up with the United Nations. Two bodies, the General Assembly, where every country has a vote and is equal. Every country has a vote and is equal. Trinidad and Tobago, a tiny little island off of the coast of Venezuela, has one vote. The United States, one vote. But then you have the Security Council, which fixes one of those problems of the League of Nations and recognizes that some countries have a bigger role in international security. So it's pretty critical how we as a world come together as separate nations to promote security.
So I'm going to start with global economy, and I have a really broad question, which you might not be able to answer directly, but I would like to ask you how the US and the European Union, as we defined it earlier, can contribute to the world market.
The US and the European Union contribute significantly to the global market. The United States is Europe's largest trading partner. Europe is one of our largest trading partners. The US economy is roughly $18 trillion a year. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of GDP. There's a difference though in our economies. When you add up exports and imports and compare that to GDP, only 20% of the United States' GDP is made up of exports and imports. That means foreign trade is only 1/5 of our economy. If you do that for Germany, it's 4/5 of the German economy is tied up in trade. That's a huge structural difference. And actually, when I say that, it makes me wonder why former econ minister Gabriel said last year when President Obama was still president that TTIP was dead, was de facto dead. When Germany's economy is 80% dependent on trade, when Hamburg as a Hanseatic city for hundreds and hundreds of years has been part of a global trade network, why would we think that we wouldn't need a trade agreement with America? Now, so I left you with that thought. Let me give you a completely different thought. Because trade, export and import of manufactured goods can send us down a rabbit hole. Send us down a rabbit hole. I told you that the US GDP is 18 trillion. Well, the London Foreign Exchange Market has a daily turnover, daily volume of $3.23 trillion. That's almost Germany's GDP every day. The New York Foreign Exchange Market is about 0.9 trillion, so $900 billion every day. That means in New York City, Germany's GDP flows through the foreign exchange market every 4 days. We don't talk enough about the flow of money and financial services. And that's actually a huge part of the international economy today.
All right, thank you for your answer, and I'd like to add another question. So Germany is so dependent on its international trade, which becomes quite obvious looking at the GDP. Do you think it is a necessity to sanction the trade between the US and Germany especially?
Do we have sanctions?
Yeah, there might be trading barriers introduced with higher import taxation, which could result in an understanding of sanctions, even though they might just be covered as new treaties.
President Trump, we just celebrated 100 days of his administration last week. He's talked a lot about fair trade. Fair trade. He's talked about correcting the imbalances between the United States and other countries. That's got a lot of our international partners concerned. What does that mean? Does that mean protectionism? So, the New York Times, about a month and a half ago, ran an article that I thought was surprising, especially since Trump has called the New York Times fake news. The New York Times is not exactly pro-Trump, but it ran an in-depth article summarizing the current state of international trade and barriers. Using World Trade Organization data, the Times showed that the average tariff applied to products entering the United States is 3.5%. The tariffs applied to European Union member states are on average 5.1%. China's up at 9, almost 10%. India's nearly 13.5%. The only country in the world with a tariff average lower than the United States is Australia at 2.5%. But the New York Times took the WTO data one step further. In addition to tariffs, started looking at the tax structures of all these countries. If you add up taxes and tariffs, the United States jumps to 9.9%. Do you know where Germany is? 25%. Tariffs and taxes. So when Trump is talking about unfair trade, and we start looking at the data, not the rhetoric, not the politics, but what's really happening, it is very easy for other countries to ship and export to the United States, and much more difficult for the United States to export to Europe, for example. So, are we in threat of sanctions? I don't know about sanctions. Do we need to look at the imbalance? Probably. And let's get beyond the politics. Let's get beyond the rhetoric. Let's look at this data and say, wow, there may be some ways that we can improve trade.
Thank you for your answer. So I think that's a really broad topic, but I'm going to move on, go a little bit towards the US. And I would like to ask you if you think that the TPP and the TTIP are missed opportunities for the American economy.
So we spent a lot of effort negotiating TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have been a multilateral free trade area. Once all of the negotiating states had ratified and joined TPP, that trade area would have captured 60% of world GDP. 60%. President Trump, after he came into office, stopped the US from moving forwards because he doesn't believe it's a fair deal for the United States. Well, that's something that we're going to have to get into a little bit more. TTIP, well, you already heard what former Econ Minister Gabriel said. Yes, it's a missed opportunity. Given how large our trading relationship is, it makes sense. It makes sense that we would have some kind of agreement on how we trade. That there would be some kind of rules about how we trade. You know, the European Union is very, very close to finalizing a trade deal with Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. The European Union is talking about, well, maybe it needs a trade deal with China. If the European Union needs trade deals to set out the rules for how companies are going to engage in economic affairs, it makes sense. It just seems logical to me that we'd have one with the United States.